Thank you, Ruth. My name is Hannah, and in our time together, I want to explore climate grief with you. In my experience as a climate activist, writer, and researcher, there is a tipping point for knowledge about a dying world, where my grief cannot be undone. I have reached that tipping point and cannot go back, no matter how much I try to guard myself against future exposure to the relentless cycle of bad news. And I'm not alone. The last decade has seen rapidly growing reports of grief, anxiety, and traumatic stress because of increasingly extreme weather events, the loss of flora and fauna, or awareness of the existential threat posed by climate breakdown. What do these experiences tell us? And can we talk about them in ways that are honest and useful, that might be transformative for our faith, for our communities, for our politics? Can we identify what it is that we grieve? Is it a hopeful past? Individual lives lost, the collapse of formerly abundant ecosystems? Perhaps our grief anticipates a frightening future or is triggered by guilt and a sense of powerlessness. Perhaps it is a post-traumatic or pre-traumatic stress response to extreme weather events. One of the problems with managing climate grief is that its sources are varied and that traditional closure is not possible. We don't get to learn to accept a particular death and move on. Climate breakdown is a grief multiplier. It is not something that we can rely on time to heal. This means we're going to have to learn to live with it, some of us much more so than others. And that means we need to learn to grieve well. Perhaps this is going to sound strange, but I want to suggest to you that there are bad things to grieve over and bad ways to do it. If our culture's collective climate and ecological grief is focused on mourning our former lives of guilt-free wastefulness, it is misdirected. And if our grief or anxiety is exercised by pushing for further border controls or by hoarding wealth for an unstable future or nihilistic excess, then it needs urgent redirection. Grief, like our other emotional responses to the world, is a learned behavior. We constantly learn what is worthy of our grief and what is not, and whose grief matters more to us. The ways emotions are expressed in the climate movement are a mirror of our experiences of the world, and these are experiences filtered by power. A couple of years ago, Nyla Burton published an article for Vice with the title, "People of Colour Experience Climate Grief More Deeply Than White People." She wrote, "Anyone can experience climate grief regardless of their identity, but for us, our grief and our anger is rooted in centuries of painful history and the current ecological violence hurled at our communities. The histories of colonialism, genocide, slavery, and systemic racism are intertwined with the history of the earth." And she points out that these two histories, these two griefs, cannot be disentangled for Black and Brown people. If this is true, then it must also be true of whiteness, that the white history of colonialism, slavery, and white supremacy cannot be disentangled from how we feel about the earth now. The grief of white people over the death of the earth is as much shaped by our experiences and histories as it is for our Black and Brown siblings. Those of us who are the beneficiaries of white supremacy and Western wealth and comfort need to examine our climate grief carefully, with the desire to orient ourselves to God's purposes for grief rather than our own. It's not that the emotions of white people are innately more sinful, but rather that sin feeds on power, and power is not evenly distributed. Now, I'm not saying that our feelings of climate and ecological grief that we should all have the same grief response to every instance of destruction or suffering around the world. We are finite creatures who cannot and should not be expected to respond to every death in the dying world in the same way. And I've chosen two quotations to share with you here, which reflect the specificity, the particularity of grief over particular places. Our social networks influence us to feel grief about something we hear more about or events that feel more unusual. And if grief is an expression of love, as it is for the two people that I've shared here, our grief takes on the shape of the places and creatures to whom we intimately belong. Our losses are particular, creatures, seasons and rhythms, futures, forests that we know or feel connected to. This is part of being human. But our feelings of grief are not just bound by space. They are politicized. We are taught, through exposure, through culture, to feel greater empathy for those with more power, even while knowing that they have, in real, measurable terms, suffered less. Those places on the earth where wounds are deeper, embedded into history, are also those whose wounds are not grieved in public. We can see the way that our context shapes our climate grief in Western expressions of despair. Climate doomerism in the minority world is a kind of arrogance. It assumes that the future is known and nothing can be done. The culture I belong to is founded on the assumption of a superior capacity for rule, seized through violence against land and people. We've imagined ourselves as the great problem solvers and architects of the earth. Perhaps we now feel guilty, but we still assume that our position is where improvement or even salvation will emerge, if it is to emerge at all. The growing dominance of despair narratives in the West is a warning to us that our grief both reflects our power and wields it. As I sit in the heart of global wealth accumulation, I can picture the future and assume that I will live to see it. We are never the ones who die first, and our proximity to power means that our despair threatens the flourishing of others. So we can grieve badly, but how can we grieve well? We can start by asking what we should grieve. Implicit in that question is the idea that we should grieve, but that this grief must be properly directed. St. Augustine made the same point in the 5th century. Sorrow is an expression of love, and what matters is what we love. Our love can be directed towards goodness. To know what the good is, Augustine looked to Christ's sorrow. If Jesus sorrows over the sins of Jerusalem, his own imminent suffering on the cross, and the death of Lazarus, then his followers should grieve over the suffering and death which sin brings about. And in the 20th century, liberation theologians also turned to Christ's sorrow as a sign of his solidarity with the poor and oppressed. Both approaches have something to tell us: what is worthy of grief, and whose grief most truly reflects divine priority. And this idea of grieving over sin can guide us today. Climate and ecological breakdown, after all, reflect the most basic human sins: the desire to be God, to accumulate power, and to do so with violent indifference. So we need to learn to redirect our love. And in response, we can feed our love of the goodness of the world by being attentive to it, by tenderly caring for the earth and the people we have in front of us. We can be willing to show compassion for those creatures that we may still lose. And in doing so, we learn how to love. But what is the role of grief in this work of love? I look to the Jewish and Christian traditions of lament. Lament is different from individual feelings of grief because lament is a form of prayer. When we cry out to God, we do not cry alone. We are part of the community of those who cry out to God, visible and invisible. In lament, we grieve together, listening to the griefs of others. This means that lamentation is not only for times we feel compelled to mourn, but also a position we take in relation to the world, a discipline which goes beyond our personal experience. Lament is prayer, expressing sorrow, anger, and desire for justice to God. Lament is woven into the life of the community. Lament is even a form of protest, as you can see in these 2 images that I've chosen here. Lament is the right response to the death which sin brings about. It is in lament that we start to speak honestly about the destruction before us. This is not a new practice. Jewish and Christian communities have, for example, prayed the lament psalms for thousands of years. But our regular prayers together can also provide space to lament the loss of a stable climate, redirecting our attention to those already suffering and trusting that God will prompt us to respond with works of love. Lament also leaves room for hope. In being directed outwards, to others, to God, it acknowledges that we do not know what will happen, and so we are called to act now. In this way, lament and hopeful action go together. Like lament, hopeful action is humbly open to an unknown future, attentive to the experiences of others, undeterred by temporary feelings of despair, committed to community, and guided by the movement of the Spirit in the world. So I invite you to lament. In lamenting with others over the death we see around us, we confront our misdirected attention and our imagined self-sufficiency. We learn what is worthy of sorrow in the eyes of God, and we learn how to love the world as though it were not ours to control. Let us lament together, and so join in God's work of healing. Thank you.